I never thought I'd leave the city, but after years of sleepless nights, crowded streets, and a relentless job that drained every ounce of life from me, I needed an escape. When I stumbled across a listing for an old farm out in the middle of nowhere, it felt like fate. The pictures showed a charming little house, acres of open land, and a barn that seemed sturdy enough for livestock. It was exactly what I needed, a fresh start. The drive out to the farm took most of the day. The road narrowed the farther I went, the pavement giving way to gravel, and finally to a dirt path flanked by dense woods. When I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the property. The house was smaller than I'd expected, but the land stretched out endlessly, bordered by a thick tree line. It was quiet, too quiet. My nearest neighbors were a good 10 miles away, and the closest town was little more than a cluster of buildings with a gas station, a general store, and a diner. The locals were friendly enough, but seemed wary of me, as if they didn't trust outsiders. "You moved out to the old Miller place?" the cashier at the general store asked as I stocked up on supplies. Her tone was casual, but her eyes carried an edge of something I couldn't quite place. "Yeah," I replied, smiling. "It's perfect for what I need. Peace and quiet." She hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "Just don't wander too far at night. Strange things happen out there." "What kind of strange things?" I asked, more amused than concerned. She shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "Just stick close to the house, all right?" I brushed it off as small-town superstition, but her words lingered as I returned to the farm. The first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and exhaustion. Starting over wasn't easy, and I knew there'd be an adjustment period. The next morning, as I walked the perimeter of the property, I noticed something strange near the edge of the woods. The grass was flattened in a circular pattern, and there were clawed footprints in the dirt. They weren't large, but their shape was odd. Too narrow for a coyote, too small for a bear. I told myself it was nothing, probably some animal I wasn't familiar with, but a nagging sense of unease crept in. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long across the land, I couldn't help but think of the cashier's warning. Strange things happen out there. As I locked the doors and drew the curtains, I told myself I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something about this place wasn't right. The second night on the farm, I was jolted awake by a sound outside my window. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the noise was too deliberate, like something heavy brushing against the side of the house. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and strained to listen. There it was again, a low, guttural growl, followed by a faint scratching sound. My first thought was coyotes. I'd heard they roamed these parts, and maybe one had wandered too close. But something about the growl didn't sit right with me. It sounded wrong, too deep, too guttural, almost like it came from something bigger. Grabbing the flashlight from my nightstand, I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain. The yard was bathed in pale moonlight, but nothing moved. I scanned the area, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark, but it revealed only the barn and the swaying branches of nearby trees. I tried to shake it off and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I decided to check on the barn. If it was coyotes, I'd need to reinforce the fences to protect the livestock I planned to buy. As I approached, the metallic tang of blood hit me before I even opened the doors. Inside, the scene was worse than I'd imagined. A goat I'd brought over from a neighboring farm as a test for the property lay sprawled in the middle of the barn floor. Its body was untouched apart from 2 puncture wounds on its neck, deep and precise. No blood surrounded it, none at all. It was as if something had drained it completely. My stomach churned as I stood there, staring at the lifeless animal. This wasn't the work of a coyote. No predator I knew would kill like this and leave the body untouched. I grabbed a shovel and buried the goat far from the house, all the while feeling like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, but there was nothing, just the stillness of the woods and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. That night, the growling returned, closer this time. I'd left the floodlights on around the property, hoping to scare off whatever was out there, but they didn't seem to help. The sound circled the house, moving slowly, deliberately, as if testing me. I sat in the living room with the shotgun I had bought earlier that day, every muscle in my body tense. The noises continued for hours, growing fainter and fainter until they finally stopped altogether. When dawn broke, I ventured outside. What I found made my blood run cold. Scattered around the barn and near the tree line were more of those strange footprints. They were small, clawed, and spaced too far apart for any animal I could name. Some of them led directly up to the barn door before disappearing entirely, as if the creature had simply vanished. For the first time, I began to consider the impossible. What if this wasn't a predator I could hunt or trap? What if it was something else entirely? I tried to shake the thought, but the unease had rooted itself deep. Whatever had killed that goat wasn't done, and I had the terrible feeling it was only getting started. By the third night, I was on edge. The strange growling, the footprints, the drained goat, they all pointed to something I couldn't explain, and my instincts screamed that I wasn't safe here. Still, I couldn't just pack up and leave. I had invested everything into this farm. It was supposed to be my fresh start, not the beginning of some waking nightmare. Determined to get to the bottom of whatever was terrorizing me, I decided to stay up all night and keep watch. I set up camp in the living room, shotgun resting across my lap and flashlight within arm's reach. Outside, the floodlights cast an eerie glow across the yard, but beyond their reach, the woods remained impenetrable, a wall of darkness that seemed to press closer with each passing hour. For a while, it was quiet, the kind of silence that feels too heavy, too unnatural. I sat there, straining to hear even the faintest sound. And then, just after midnight it came, a faint rustling, barely audible at first, carried on the still night air. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be coming from just outside the window. I held my breath, every nerve in my body screaming for me to move, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, staring at the darkened glass, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. Then I saw them, two glowing eyes, low to the ground, staring at me from just beyond the window. They were an unnatural shade of red, like embers smoldering in the darkness. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. I couldn't tell what they belonged to, an animal, a person, or something else entirely. But those eyes held a malice I'd never felt before. It was as if they were looking straight through me, seeing every secret, every fear. Finally, I snapped out of my trance and raised the flashlight, shining it directly at the window. The beam cut through the dark, but by the time it reached the spot where the eyes had been, they were gone. Heart pounding, I bolted the doors and checked every window, making sure every lock was secure. I even dragged a heavy piece of furniture in front of the back door, for good measure. But the night wasn't over. Around 3 a.m., the growling started again, this time accompanied by a scraping sound, like claws dragging across wood. It came from the back of the house, near the barn. Against my better judgment, I grabbed the shotgun and stepped outside. The floodlights illuminated the yard, but the barn loomed in shadow, its doors slightly ajar. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound brave. No answer, just the growl, low and guttural, echoing from inside the barn. I took a step forward, then another, the shotgun raised and ready. As I reached the barn door, the growl stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. Pushing the door open with the barrel of the gun, I stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of decay. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing overturned hay bales and scattered tools. And then I saw it. In the far corner, something crouched low to the ground, its back turned to me. It was small, no taller than a child, with spines running down its hunched back. The dim light caught the glint of its claws as it tore into something on the floor, a carcass, though I couldn't tell what kind. Before I could react, it turned. Its face was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a twisted mix of animal and something horribly human. Its glowing red eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then it let out a screech, high-pitched and piercing, and lunged. I stumbled backward, barely managing to fire the shotgun. The blast echoed through the barn, and the creature let out a guttural cry before darting into the shadows. I didn't wait to see where it went. I ran back to the house, bolting the door behind me, my heart racing. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't going to stop. I didn't sleep at all after my encounter in the barn. Every creak, every gust of wind against the house made my pulse race. By dawn, the fear hadn't subsided. It had only grown. The thing I saw in the barn wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It was something in between, something unnatural, and I had no idea what it wanted or how to stop it. I spent the morning reinforcing every door and window. I dragged furniture in front of entrances, nailed boards across the weaker ones, and even set up makeshift barricades in the hallway. It wasn't much, but it made me feel like I was doing something, anything, to protect myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that none of it would matter. Around noon, I went back to the barn, this time armed with more than just a shotgun. I carried a heavy flashlight and a crowbar, ready to confront whatever was lurking there. But when I opened the doors, the barn was empty. No carcass, no blood, no sign of the creature. What struck me most were the claw marks. They were everywhere, on the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. Deep gouges carved into the wood, as though the creature had been climbing. My unease deepened. I had hoped to find some kind of evidence, something to explain what was happening. Instead, I was left with more questions. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. I didn't leave the house again. I couldn't bring myself to. As night fell, the air grew heavier, charged with a strange energy I couldn't explain. It was as if the entire property was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then the scratching started. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, like nails dragging lightly against glass. It came from the kitchen window. I froze, shotgun in hand, and listened. The sound moved, circling the house. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I followed it from room to room, the barrel of the shotgun trembling as I aimed it at each window. But every time I got close, the noise moved, always staying one step ahead. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the scratching stopped. For a moment, the silence was almost worse. My ears strained to catch any sound, any hint of where it had gone. And then I heard it, a thud. It came from the roof. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. Whatever this thing was, it was on top of the house. The thudding grew louder, more frantic, as though it was searching for a way in. I ran to the hallway, crouching low and aiming the shotgun toward the ceiling. The sound moved again, this time to the attic. My stomach turned. The attic door was inside the house. I backed into the living room, heart hammering, as the thuds grew louder, closer. The attic door creaked, a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. I aimed the shotgun at the door, finger on the trigger, and waited. It creaked open. Something moved in the darkness above, just out of sight. I could hear it breathing, a low, rasping sound that sent chills down my spine. And then, slowly, it began to descend. I didn't breathe as the thing crept down from the attic. At first, all I saw were its claws, long and sharp, ripping the edge of the hatch. Then came its head, tilting unnaturally, glowing red eyes piercing through the shadows. It stopped halfway, crouched on the edge of the opening, as if testing me, watching my every move. I gripped the shotgun tighter, my palms slick with sweat, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could hear it. "Stay back," I whispered, my voice barely audible. It didn't listen. The creature dropped to the floor with an unnatural grace, its spines glinting in the dim light. Up close, it was even more horrifying, a grotesque blend of animal and something far worse. Its twisted, hunched form seemed to defy nature, and the smell of rot filled the air. I aimed the shotgun and fired. The blast was deafening in the confined space, and the creature let out a guttural screech as the pellets struck its chest. It staggered back, clawing at the wound, but it didn't fall. Instead, it fixed its glowing eyes on me, more enraged than ever. Before I could fire again, it lunged. I barely had time to dodge, the creature's claws slashing through the air where I'd just been standing. I scrambled backward, knocking over furniture as I tried to put distance between us. The creature moved with terrifying speed, its movements jerky and unnatural. It slashed at me again, this time grazing my arm. The pain was sharp, but adrenaline kept me moving. I fired another shot, this time hitting its shoulder. It let out another screech and reeled back, giving me just enough time to make a break for the door. I ran outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The floodlights flickered, their beams casting erratic shadows across the yard. Behind me, the creature burst through the door, its screech echoing into the night. I turned and fired again, but the creature was relentless. It darted to the side, disappearing into the shadows. My eyes darted around the yard, searching for any sign of movement, but the darkness felt alive, shifting and closing in. Then I heard it, a low growl, coming from the tree line. The creature emerged, its glowing eyes locked on me. But it wasn't alone. More figures stepped out of the shadows, their forms hunched and twisted, their eyes burning with the same red glow. There were 3, for maybe more. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just one creature. It was a pack. I backed toward my truck, fumbling with the keys as the creatures closed in. Their growls grew louder, more menacing, a cacophony of sound that drowned out my own racing thoughts. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and climbed inside, slamming it shut just as the first creature lunged at me. Its claws raked against the window, leaving deep gouges in the glass. I started the engine, the headlights illuminating the creatures as they surrounded the truck. For a moment, I froze, staring at their horrifying forms. Then I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck roared to life, tearing through the yard and onto the dirt road. The creatures chased after me, their screeches piercing the night. But I didn't look back. I drove until the house, and the woods were far behind me, until the first rays of dawn broke through the horizon. Even now, I can still hear their growls in my nightmares, still see their glowing eyes when I close my own. I don't know what they were or why they chose me. All I know is that I'll never go back.